Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is July 14th, 2022, and this is your daily Ukraine update. And while Russia's operational pause continues on the backfield, things get even weirder as Russia is now, I'll just break it down in a minute. Let's get into it. So, there is no change to the map. Literally, you can see their update log right here. It says some clarifications to the front, which means that literally we're talking about not even one village has changed hands. Now, when you look at the actual invasion news, you can see that there's a bunch of attacks that every single one of them are repelled. Usually what this means is that they are what's called probing attacks. And probing attacks are when you engage the enemy with a pretty low amount of force, only enough force to get them to show their hand, right? And so what this does is allows the attacker to gain intelligence about where the enemy is, what their defenses look like, what areas are tightly defended and on a hair trigger, which ones are lightly defended. And so by continually sort of probing the defense, you get to learn more about where the enemy may be vulnerable and to what. So that's probably what we're seeing here with the minor incursions, minor harassment. It could also literally just be harassment, just to keep the enemy on their toes, to keep them reacting. What's sort of interesting is that it looks like this Sloviansk and Kramatorsk remain two very active fronts, since that appears to be where the majority of the probing action has taken place. Again, is it a deception? I don't think so. As we've talked about, I think the larger goal here is still the seizure of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Now, let's talk about the weird part. And the weird part is, well, Russia's trying to raise some volunteer battalions, but the term volunteer doesn't seem to line up very well with the West. Ukraine, as you know, has Western volunteers. These volunteers are paid either no salary or a minimal salary commensurate with Ukraine service in the Ukraine armed forces, I believe. In contrast, Russia's volunteer battalions, first off, they're not being raised by Moscow. They're not federal. They are basically the U.S. equivalent of states. Russia has ordered its states to raise volunteer battalions. Again, a solution to not have to go into full mobilization or a full, what in the U.S. we probably call like a draft or a mobilization of all reserve forces. In Russia, I think it's a little different, right? There's mandatory service. I think their reserve forces are very extensive, so it would look more like a draft. Right. It is a, quote, volunteer mobilization, and all 85 federal subjects, so like states, regions that include occupied Sevastopol and Crimea, are to recruit and financially incentivize volunteers to form new battalions. Now, what's fascinating to me is a 6-month contract is what they're looking for. The upper age is 50, but it says 60 for separate military specialties. I imagine probably 60 for, I'm hoping like logistics, pay, anything that's going to be well beyond the front lines, administrative. Still, 50 is old, but usually the sign of a pretty desperate country, but not the preposterously old that we saw in that volunteer battalion video, where it looked like the average age was probably about 60. All right, 6-month contract, and salaries range from $3,700 to $6,000 a month in Russia, mind you. In Russia. So that is a preposterous amount of money. To give you an idea, the Western speaking, some of their information warfare, like government employees, the ones who sort of post online, they usually make about $700 a month. So we're talking about just shy of 10 times the average salary. So if we sort of extrapolated it to the US, we'd be looking at something like I don't know, $250,000 a month to like $500,000 a month, right? So the regions, right? Oh, yeah, some of them can also offer an additional $3,400 as an enlistment bonus. So, this is a lot like in the bottom of the Iraq War. The U.S. offered massive enlistment bonuses, especially to certain MOSs like fuel truck driver, fueler, that were like $50,000, which you have to remember in like 2006, 2007 was a lot of money, but in 2008 it was a massive amount of money. And I definitely went through basic training because of an elaborate drug deal. I went through basic training with people who said, they were like, hey, I was 28 years old or 29, 30 years old, and I have a family to take care of. And the Army was like, I will give you $50,000 if you agree to join, and healthcare and benefits for your family. And he was like, I was like, yes, absolutely. So again, I think anyone who puts themselves at risk to take care of their family like that deserves some credit. But man, this is for Russia a lot of money. Of course, it's being pulled out of the region's budget, not the federal budget. So it's not clear on how they'll be able to pay this, for Russia, huge amount of money. They said their target number is about 400 men per battalion. Now, in the U.S., that's between a battalion and a company. That's like a light battalion. Typically, a battalion's around 800 to 1,000. But still, 85 regions, you could pull up 34,000 new service members, a proper regiment, and a significant increase in the number of capable fighting soldiers. Now, this may sound like a good idea, but we see here that the actual training is extremely short. It's a month long, so 30 days of training. Now, this is, pretty preposterous. In the U.S., for example, when we mobilized our National Guard units and reserve units for deployment to Iraq and Afghanistan, these were soldiers that had already completed their minimum necessary training and had been doing, their weekend drills. So 2 weeks every year, plus 1 weekend every month. So again, an annual training, something like, several hundred hours of training a year. And then when they deployed, they still spent 90 days of dedicated pre-deployment training. And then they went on their year-long deployment. So the idea that these guys, after long periods of inactivity, are going to go on 30 days of training and then be cycled over to the front. Now, it says they won't be combat ready, but I assume that refers to things like being issued gear, being moved to the front, being assigned to a larger combat formation. So, this is not a good sign. This is a sign of someone who is really starting to reach for forces when you're paying out these huge salaries to attract people. And here's the other thing. If you're a commander, imagine not having this salary, right? If you're a Russian active duty soldier who's already been grinding it out for, 4 or 5 months, seeing rando volunteers who are probably too old or too out of shape to come in making 10 times what you are is pretty aggravating. So I'm really curious to see how Russia solves that problem. Or will commanders just assign these units to the most dangerous positions, being like, hey, earn your $250,000 a year. Or will they have larger pay increases or hazard pay to soldiers already in the field? I don't know. It's to be determined. Anyway, guys, thanks so much for joining me on this. And as always, if you want me to do video breakdowns for combat vids that are too wild for YouTube, man, become a member of the Patreon. Thanks to my Lieutenant tier patrons. I'll see you guys in the next one.